Committee. Thanks to our curriculum committee for their wonderful study groups they've presented to us on the spring summer preferential ballot. Please go to the Plato member page and vote for your 4 favorite topics. Your vote will help create a rich and varied assortment of SDGs for all of us. Thanks. Here's Dave Roloff. Dave?
Okay, boys and girls, here we are once again. We're very, very happy to have Lisa Napoli speaking to us today. She was raised in Brooklyn, New York, a graduate of Hampshire College in scenic Amherst, Massachusetts, but has lived almost more places than I have, including Manhattan, North Carolina, and since 2004 in scenic downtown Los Angeles. Among her many accomplishments are her working as a journalist in a wide variety of news outlets, including CNN, the New York Times, Cyber Crimes, MSNBC, and the public radio show Marketplace. She has written numerous books, the 2 of which are relevant to our discussion today. The first of those being Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Marketing of the 24-Hour News, which looks obviously at the origin of the world's first all-news cable channel. Her most recent book, which I highly, highly recommend to you, is entitled Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki, the story of the founding mothers of NPR, wrapped around the emergence of public radio and the second wave of feminism in the 70s. Over the past few years, she has also been, but not since the pandemic, led an award-winning voluntary cooking group at the Downtown Women's Center in Skid Row of Los Angeles. And we're very, very happy to listen to Lisa. I punt it to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm excited to see that you're in my hometown library. That's so super.
That's
wow.
Right. That's right. And many of the people who are from that hometown don't recognize that library. So what does that tell you about them?
I met my husband in the library, in the LA Public Library up the street. So I'm a library gal. What can I say?
All right. I'm gonna pull out and let you do your thing.
Super. Thank you so much to all of you for tuning in, Zoom fatigue aside, and for the invitation to talk with you. I'm very excited about it, to have a smart dialogue with you about the news business. I went last night to a screening of the new Cousteau documentary, if you've heard about this, Becoming Cousteau. And in a Q&A afterwards, somebody said something about why is the world basically gone to hell? And I thought to myself, because I didn't want to insert myself in this presentation that I was just a spectator of, it's all about the media. Really, every aspect of our society that's falling apart has to do with the proliferation of mass media. So that's what I'm going to sort of talk with you, or I am going to talk with you about today. And just to correct Dave a little bit, I've written 4 books. He said that we're going to talk about my 2 most recent ones, but really my first 2 play into the subject of the 24-hour news cycle and how it's impacted the world and how we relate to it. The first book was Radio Shangri-La, which is about how I went to the Kingdom of Bhutan at the dawn of democratic rule, just a few years after they allowed television in. Now, that was only I was there about 12 years ago, and television had only been there for a few years. If you know about Bhutan, it was a very interesting sociological study, unintentionally, where a place that once did not have mass media, all of a sudden overnight allowed it in around 20-something years ago. Fascinating place, and what a fascinating experience for me as a career media person to witness the transformation of a little secluded Himalayan kingdom with the advent of mass media. I went to help start a radio station that was a youth-oriented radio station. So, of course, the people I was dealing with were the first generation of people to come up with media, in mass media at all, of any sort. I met people who were my age, I'm in my late 50s, who had never seen paper until they were in their late teens, paper. So it was a fascinating experience. My second book was about Ray Kroc and Joan Kroc. I wanted to write a book about Joan Kroc only, but I couldn't sell a book about Joan Kroc only because people really didn't know who she was. And shockingly, we'll get to this in a minute, there's a lot of sexism in the publishing world, even though curiously, the publishing world is dominated by women, and most of the people who buy books are women. But once I added Ray to the mix and the story of how Joan, who is one of the most under-recognized and crazy philanthropists of the 20th century, how she got the money that she gave away because of Ray, who, as you probably know, helped popularize fast food and McDonald's. I was able to sell this book, and it too has to do with the proliferation of mass media, because of course that fortune that was amassed really could not have been amassed if it wasn't in a media saturated culture. Of course, it was a different media saturated culture than the one we live in today, and the one that is the focus of the two books we're going to talk about right now. Sorry, I have all these props, but I don't do PowerPoint, so this is the next best thing. So I started my career as a 17-year-old kid in working class Brooklyn, going to be an intern at a scrappy upstart. This was in 1981, called Cable News Network, disparagingly referred to by both people in it and the three major networks which dominated the media landscape at the time: ABC, NBC, CBS, for anybody who forgets. I went to work at CNN in 1981, a year after it launched. It was literally as easy as picking up the phone, dialing 212-555. Oh, actually, I didn't have to do the 212 then. 555-1212 from my summer job when I was home from college, and saying, hey, somebody told me that there's this new cable thing going on in the base of the World Trade Center, and I'd like an internship. Can I have one? And they said, sure, come in tomorrow. That's how simple it was, because nobody knew what it was. And most of you, I'm sure, if you reach back in to the day in 1980, June 1st, 1980, in the 80s, cable did not dominate our lives. In fact, it was just coming up. And when CNN launched in 1980, it only had 1.5 million subscribers. So there were only about 16 million homes in the entire country that had cable television, and only a fraction of those were able to get CNN. And nobody believed that anyone would want to tune in to news, except perhaps my father. We couldn't get it in Brooklyn anyway, but my father was a news junkie from the time my earliest memories. He would come home with an armful of newspapers every night and fall asleep to talk radio in New York, only possible because we were in New York every night, turn on the news at 6 and 11. He was an early news junkie, even though he wasn't an educated person. He was zealously consuming the media and the news. But in 1980, the conventional wisdom was that there weren't that very many Vince Napolis out there, excuse me, that there were very few people who would want to consume news, because news was seen as an eat your vegetables kind of proposition, not, maybe a civic duty, but not something that would be certainly financially viable, which of course is what it all comes down to in television. So all of that by way of saying that several years ago, I decided, knowing that the 40th anniversary of CNN was coming up, and watching the polarized world into which we live, and having worked at the New York Times covering a little over 20 years ago the dawn of the internet revolution that has taken over our lives, I decided to write a book about the history of CNN, because I didn't really understand the world that it came out of. I knew what I knew as a dopey 17-year-old who got lucked into an internship that then turned into another internship, and then another, and then finally a very low-paying job in Atlanta, the headquarters of CNN, in 1984 when I graduated from college. But I really didn't understand the history of the building in which CNN was launched, which was an old Jewish country club that had been left for dead in Midtown Atlanta, and even bigger than that, the ecosystem, the media ecosystem that Ted Turner, who was not a news junkie, who was not married to Jane Fonda, who was actually decidedly right of center, even though when we talk about right and left and politics 40 years ago, of course, that world is completely different now than it was then. But Ted Turner was basically a cowboy who got interested in cable in its early days, and the marriage of cable and satellite is what really dazzled him. And some of you may remember, before he became infirm, which he is today, he was many years ago an award-winning yachtsman. He was a wild, larger than life person who would be Me Too'd off the world stage in about 20 seconds if he was still around today. But back then he was this wild playboy, award-winning yachtsman, as I say, and a very daring businessman who took a great leap and started a news channel, even though he said at the time he couldn't care less about news. He didn't watch the news, he didn't read the news, he didn't have the time, he wasn't interested, but he wanted to create a channel that was new in a landscape that was completely blank. There was very, very little out there on cable, and that was what he came up with, was CNN. Okay, fast forward to the real reason I think I was invited to speak today, and we'll tie back to Ted Turner in a minute. My next book, Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki. Let's see if I hold it up correctly. So what happened was I finished this book about Ted Turner and CNN and the making of 24-hour news to step back from this polarized world that we live in and to look at what happened that allowed this channel to begin. There's 16 years elapsed from the creation of CNN to the creation of Fox News and MSNBC, which came up at the same time in 1996 in very different ways. I won't go into a whole history of the cable universe, but that's what really changed everything, as did the creation of the internet, or the popularization of the internet and this digital universe that we now live in, that, as I say, I covered for the New York Times Cyber Times back in the late 90s, and then again over at MSNBC in early 2000s. But to step back a little bit further, once I was done with that CNN book, it was around the time that once I handed it in, this is before the pandemic, that Koki Roberts passed away. This is in September of 2019. And my editor of the CNN book at Abrams Press, who coincidentally or not was born the same year that CNN started, 1980, said to me, you say you want to write a just quote unquote straight biography next time. Why don't you write a book about Koki Roberts? And I thought about it, with her having just passed away, because I knew very little about her. I knew, of course, that she was a superstar, best-selling author, on radio, on television, media dominatrix, if you will, but I really didn't know much more about her than that. I'd never really thought much about her. And in talking with some of my friends from public radio, they suggested, well, we discovered just in our research that NPR was turning 50 this year. May 3rd, 1971, to be exact, is when the switch flipped on All Things Considered, the very first offering from NPR. But indelibly entwined with the creation of NPR was the fact that these four women, Susan Stamberg, Linda Wertheimer, Nina Totenberg, and Koki Roberts, all worked there at a seminal time in the network. Now, you could argue that everything is a seminal time in our existence, but it was a particularly interesting time because in the 1970s, I'll step back for a second. Lyndon Johnson in 1967 was concerned, as were many intelligent people, about the impact of commercial broadcasting on the American mind share, on the American zeitgeist. And that concern gave birth to the Public Broadcasting Act in 1967. The idea that other people needed a voice at the table besides the three commercial broadcast networks that had a very homogenized way of looking at everything from news to sports to entertainment, of which they were the dominant forces, the dominant purveyors. And certainly, as you know, news used to be just served up a couple times a night, maybe a little bit locally, depending on where you lived, and once nationally. So the Broadcasting Act really was the Television Act. And it was only because a bunch of people, a small bunch of men who worked at universities around the nation, decided that they wanted to make sure that educational radio, which was mostly licensed, non-commercial radio to universities, for the most part, around the nation, should have a seat at that table. And so they forced their way into that Public Television Act. It got named the Public Broadcasting Act, and $5 million was allocated to create the first public radio network. So here we are, 1971. There are very few people who are interested in radio at this point, because radio has been big-footed off the stage by television, which at that point had been around 20 years, a little bit less actually, and commercially, and had just become so enormous that radio was a marginalized force. And for many of you who are here in Los Angeles, you may be aware of the fact that most cars, since we're a car culture here, did not have FM radio built into them. And most radio sets that you might have in your house while you were cooking dinner or doing chores with your transistor radio in the backyard did not have FM radio. So basically this NPR, National Public Radio, was launched on a spectrum, if you will, that did not get much coverage, not unlike it was the case with CNN and cable when Ted Turner launched CNN. So NPR was launching into a vacuum where there were about 90 stations around the country that were able to qualify with an extremely minuscule budget. I think the top budget allowed, the minimum budget allowed was $25,000 a year operating budget for a station licensed to a university. And it had to have a certain amount of power so that it could transmit a certain distance. And other than that, that was the basic rule. You had to be on the air a certain number of hours a day, not 24/7, to qualify to carry what was going to be National Public Radio. And nobody who came to work for National Public Radio, even among these esteemed gentlemen who had advocated for public radio to begin, knew what was going to be on public radio. They just knew that there needed to be some sort of unifying force similar to the NBC, CBS, ABC force that, of course, had started on radio and had now transferred over also to television more powerfully. So in 1971, as they were crewing up this NPR, and they had decided that they would do the first offering would be this evening newscast, 5 p.m. Morning drive time was, of course, a better time. More people listened to the radio in the morning, but nobody wanted to wake up that early. So they started their first newscast to be on at 5 p.m. and they couldn't find enough people to work on it because there weren't people trained as they are today. They go to Columbia Journalism School, Missouri Journalism School, fill in the blank journalism school to learn radio production because they all want to be podcasters and they all want to be the next Cokie Roberts. Well, they didn't find people. So because of that, they were able, and also because of some open-mindedness on the part of the early management, not entirely, but in some key places, people decided that they'd allow women to come work there. And not only would they allow women to come work at NPR, women were mostly, again, I don't have to tell the group, the constituency here, I'm sure many of you have your own stories. Women were not allowed to have anything other than administrative jobs in journalism. Of course, this is true in many fields, but particularly in journalism. They were not allowed to hold the microphone. And if they did hold the microphone, in the rare cases that women were allowed to be out in the field collecting news as reporters, they weren't allowed to deliver it on the air. Some of you may even remember the late, great Pauline Frederick, who was a real true pioneer in that sense. But nonetheless, what happened was women got their feet in the door at this place called National Public Radio, which was, for anybody who's worked in the internet business, they call it a soft launch. It was the equivalent of a soft launch. They went on the air with very little resource, very little understanding of how they were going to fill their hour-and-a-half airtime every day, and basically really unsure who was going to contribute. They had this grandiose idea that these 90 stations might contribute, but they weren't really sure how it was all going to work. And into that messy landscape stepped, in particular, the first two characters I write about, Susan Stamberg and Linda Wertheimer. I'll invert that because Linda Wertheimer was hired a month before Susan Stamberg, but Susan Stamberg comes first in the title of my book, not only because she became NPR's first star, but also because even before she stepped into National Public Radio, she had worked at WAMU, which was the local educational radio station. It was a scrappy upstart. She managed to get a job there, again, because nobody else would work there. Nobody else would work there for such little money. And her husband, agreed to allow her to take a pay cut from the secretarial job she had at the New Republic, where her greatest joy was being able to write headlines. She took a pay cut and moved over to WAMU, where she produced a public affairs show. And when they were crewing up NPR, they hired her, not on the air, but behind the scenes. Same thing with Linda Wertheimer, who many of you remember was a longtime host of NPR. She was eager and desperate to get on the air. She'd worked at CBS Radio in New York, moved to DC when she got married, but was told time and again, women are not allowed to become broadcasters. So basically in this book, I tell the story about how these four women entered this system, this nascent system, and how the system simultaneously built itself up really against all odds. Nobody was quite sure that it would make it, how it would make it, how to attract an audience. And really what was also startling for me to know is that their early history was so precarious that in 1982, the whole place almost imploded due to fiscal mismanagement and lack of understanding about how to financially exist. So the story is really an incredible story of women coming into a place that was basically too poor to discriminate. It was some open-mindedness. It was mostly they couldn't afford to say no. And once the women got their feet in the door, not just these four women, but these four women in a most blockbuster sense, they were able to make inroads in a way that women were just starting to be able to in media and in society, of course, in the 70s. More generally. So before I'll start looking at your questions in just a second, but I just want to say that what's been really interesting for me as a career media person who feels immense concern and guilt, and who in Bhutan was dazzled by the fact that there were people who understood. I mean, of course, it's a much smaller universe than we are in the United States, but nonetheless, there were people who were so concerned when television was allowed in, having seen what the impact it had on the rest of the world, that they believed that it was important to teach media literacy to their young people, to help them understand and read, if you will, the images that they saw and make sense of them, and to have critical thinking skills when they consumed the media. When Bhutan first let television in 1999, they allowed a cable channel in from next door India, because they didn't have, certainly much to put out of their own. And there was wrestling on that cable channel. And all of a sudden there was a behavioral issue in schools where kids, mostly little boys, were beating up little boys, other little boys and girls, because they saw on television this terrible concept of wrestling without understanding that it was a sport or a joke or theatrics. And for me, writing these two books has been a really wonderful lesson. And I hope if you read them that you'll agree in understanding how we got to this polarizing world that we're in today, where people maniacally check their iPhones, even though it has no bearing whatsoever on their daily life, to keep that up, that constant connection. We've been trained slowly but surely. It's not just because of the iPhone or Steve Jobs or the computer. Even before that, drip by drip, we've been learning alternate ways of looking at the world, looking at a screen, listening to a device, and that's altered our perception of the world around us as well as each other. And that's not to say it's all bad, but it has created a nation or a planet of news junkies, interconnectivity in a way that I really hope that will begin to address. I know many of us have these conversations with our friends and loved ones. Hopefully people have them with their children, but how to make sense of it. Well, if I knew that, I wouldn't be here with you right now. I'd hopefully be doing something about it besides sparking the dialogue. I want to address a couple questions that have come in that sort of fit into what I've been asking. Someone asked about the mutual broadcasting system. Yes, mutual broadcasting was around. There were several other alternative networks that popped up. Certainly in the early days of television, I talk about them in my book Up All Night about the creation of CNN. But none of them could ever match the might of ABC, NBC, and CBS, in large part because of the phone. The phone plays a big part in media history, and particularly this history that I write here, and actually in NPR's history too, because some of you may be aware that before the more robust and sophisticated advances that we have now, and certainly before the communications satellite, the way information was transmitted around this country was over phone lines, not just telegraph and not just phone calls, obviously, but other signals as well. And all the upstarts that came up around that couldn't ever compete because they couldn't cut the deals that the three major networks cut with the phone company, AT&T. And some of you probably remember the breakup of Into the Baby Bells, not to get too wonky into telecommunications history, but that's what prevented anybody who did want to start a rival from flourishing. Okay, Barbara is asking, did the four women know each other before they started working at NPR? No, they did not. And a large part of the success that they felt once they came into the system was that kind of war-weary feeling that one gets in a startup and at a time where they were in the minority, which was they were in the Washington press corps as women were coming into it, but where they still certainly weren't equal, and fighting for acknowledgement and acceptance both inside NPR and out. And so this made them connect at a greater level. And also it really is just kismet. I'm sure you've all had people you've met at jobs over the course of your career who you carried with you for the rest of your life, even if it wasn't at that workplace. And in this case, it was just a unique situation that certainly all three of them, Koki stayed in a sort of tangential sense. All four of them stayed allied with NPR throughout their careers. So it's a really interesting moment in time. And I can assure you from understanding public radio as it is today, it does not exist like that any longer, sadly. Dave, are you going to help me wrangle questions, or would you like me to keep just chatting on? Or it looks like there's a bunch in here.
Yeah, I'm ready. Let me manage them.
Okay, great.
Talk to us about, is it your view that each of these entities, CNN and NPR, added to political polarization or is an antidote to political polarization? What role do you see that those two entities played in the political polarization?
Excellent question. You know, if you step back to the early 80s and you think about the fact that before there was cable television, the idea that a presidential press conference or fill in the blank governmental body press briefing would be aired to the public. It didn't happen. There were isolated instances, one being, of course, the assassination of President Kennedy, that had dominated airwaves. But until there was cable television, and actually NPR, because NPR covered congressional hearings in the late 70s, still sleepy upstart, gaining some traction. They covered the Panama Canal treaty hearings in the late 70s with Linda Wertheimer anchoring them. This is pre-C-SPAN, pre-CNN. We as citizens couldn't tune in the way that one can tune in now. A person can tune in anywhere on the globe and find out just about anything in an instant. But back then in the 70s and 80s, that just wasn't possible. So my belief is that, yes, in answer to your question, it's both a polarizing and a unifying force, because it opened the world to us. It allowed us to see inside our governance in a way that we never could before, which is a good thing. And it freaked a lot of people out in power. It took Congress many years to agree to allow cameras and microphones onto the floor, because lawmakers were very, very concerned, especially older ones, about having this lens trained on them. They were used to doing their business basically mostly in private. I mean, yes, a reporter might sit in on a session, but it wasn't the same as we know as having a camera on you. So incrementally over time, I guess incrementally over time is redundant, but incrementally, that has given way. And once you introduce the politicization of the news business that happened when Roger Ailes and Fox came in 1996, which forced CNN, which was then, a teenager, and MSNBC, which was also new, into jockeying for its position. That's when the polarization happened. The other problem is that when CNN started, the vision of Reese Schoenfeld, the founder hired by Ted Turner, who was a lifelong newsman, who was so excited about finding a way finally to bust the network triopoly of news. His vision was, finally, we'll be able to have a story unfold before a viewer's very eyes. It doesn't have to be served up on a platter by the same people, the same types of people, homogenous news reporters who you saw at the news networks. Well, that was a really heady and marvelous idea, but the problem was that there wasn't always something unfolding, and even following something in unformed state takes time and money and personnel and trained personnel. So what did you have happen to fill the airtime? They started putting people on who argued with each other. There's plenty of people.
So it was just to fill time.
Right, exactly. Besides book authors who always will come on and talk about something, political people will come on and fight about something. And,
well, give us more book authors and fewer fighters. That's my view on that. So among the many assignments that you've handled over the years, which had the greatest impact on you, and which one do you think had the greatest impact on our audience?
Well, as a young woman, 1986, sitting in the CNN newsroom and writing update after update, which was great training, but very tedious after a while, repetitive, needless to say, watching on a monitor as Krista McAuliffe went up into space on the shuttle Challenger and watching it disintegrate before my very eyes, and then getting a promotion because I was so good and calm at writing and rewriting as news was ticking in over the wire. That was a very formidable moment in my career, because it started to plant the seed for me, even though I was very young at that point, not very far ahead, that I didn't really want to do that I didn't want to be the person chasing the ambulances, as we say in the news business. And then since I couldn't find a way out, and then wound up landing in Waco, Texas, when the David Koresh standoff happened. That solidified it too. And then at 9/11, I had lost my job at MSNBC and was segueing over to become a technology writer only, not on the air any longer. And I literally thanked the heavens that I wasn't on the ground during 9/11. So those are three key moments for me personally, for all of us as a society, of course, that convinced me I didn't want to be in that breaking news world. I should have become a media historian a long time ago. But I think we've obviously lived through an incredible period of time. Every period of time is marked by strife and all sorts of issues, but the difference is that now that we can see them instantaneously, and I think that that's had a huge impact on all of us.
So is being based in Los Angeles a good thing for your career or a bad thing for you?
Oh, that's a really good question. We talk about that all the time. Actually, at age 57, I started my master's degree in biography and memoir, even though I've written 4 books, because I'd like to be able to teach, and I don't have an advanced degree. And that's at CUNY in New York.
Well, maybe you shouldn't have dropped out of all those programs you were in.
No, I haven't dropped out of any. I've never gone for a master's.
Well, yeah, one of the little things one of the little write-ups I saw on you, and she's dropped out of multiple master's programs. So you better correct the record on that.
Yeah, please. I'm sure that that's not me. I know what I've said in my bio is that I've worked for many failed media startups,
okay,
but I've never been in a master's program before. And so I finally, in answer to your question, signed on for one in New York, which is, more the epicenter of the publishing industry and is my hometown. And I do find that a lot of people in the book business don't take Angelenos seriously, nor do they believe that we don't all want to write episodic television or screenplays. But I have had a very fertile past 12 years as far as book writing here on Bunker Hill in downtown Los Angeles, which I find an endlessly fascinating place. So
what do you think the effect of social media is having on the news?
I think it's made it even worse. Everything that we can say about 24/7 news and its impact on how we relate to each other and to the news around us is accelerated even more. And I think that Twitter and Facebook are, except when I, can communicate with a relative, which I would do on Facebook, or a high school friend, which I would have done anyway, I think they're very, very, very devastating.
So what do you do about it?
If I knew, what I personally do about it is, I'll tell you, I don't watch television. I don't watch television news. I don't listen to much radio. And I try to use as little social media as possible. Sadly, I have to use some because I'm expected as a writer to have, a following. So I post things that I hope are relevant to the things that are interesting to me. But I don't post pictures of the food I'm eating or my medical procedures or such. I try not to engage with it in the way that I don't want to have to engage with it with other people. So
there was a lengthy struggle in many big time publications like the Times and the Washington Post about how to talk about Donald Trump when he isn't necessarily being truthful. And I think the way that ultimately came out was that they decided that if something wasn't true, they were going to say it wasn't true. And that sort of escalated to the point almost that they're prepared to call him a liar under certain circumstances. What's your view about how the media should deal with political actors who, for example, argue that the last election was stolen from them? How should the media deal with that?
If I knew the answer to it, I would still be working in the media. I'll take as an example Los Angeles, where we have another major corruption scandal that's just unfolded with our city council in the last week with Mark Ridley Thomas. I live in council member Jose Huizar's district, or he's thankfully not our council member any longer. He's a disaster. It's a disaster. And I would argue that part of the reason it's a disaster is that there's no resource directed, very little resource directed toward watchdogging those people in office. And that if we watchdog people in office, I don't know if you remember years ago, not that many years ago, there was a corruption scandal in Bell and Mayflower, small towns, poor towns with immigrant populations, people who have nothing to, no time to watchdog their elected officials, if they've even elected the officials that govern the place where they live. And there was all this financial scandal because nobody was watching. Nobody has anybody covering Bell and Maywood, et cetera. So I think the first line of defense is easy for me to say because I don't have to budget for it, but is having people watchdog our elected officials. I find some of that disingenuous, that conversation that you're talking about, disingenuous. CNN loved that Donald Trump was president because it was good for business. And I'm not an apologist for any of the cable networks. As I said a few minutes ago, I don't watch them. I can't watch them. I find I get too sick when I watch it. And that's not just because Donald Trump is a lunatic, but they gave birth to Donald Trump. Television gave birth to Donald Trump. And I just honestly don't know what the answer is, but certainly one answer is saying not just Donald Trump, but that anybody who is lying is lying. That asks the question, what's the truth? And your truth today is different than what my truth is. What is truth? Sadly, that's a whole other conversation. And
Okay, let's have that conversation.
Yeah, well, let's have it.
And NPR.
I'm sure you have an opinion on it.
No, sure. But we don't give out Dave's opinions that much in this form. So what is your spin on NPR? What is the slant of NPR?
I think it's slanted to the left. That's why I can't listen to it. I probably am slanted to the left in my political beliefs, but I don't want to hear it. I want to read something. I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, and the Economist. And I actually said to a friend of mine a few weeks ago how much I really value the Wall Street Journal. She's a very educated person, and she was disgusted with me. She said, "How could you read the Wall Street Journal? It's so right wing." I said, "Well, actually, it's not the coverage. The news coverage is not right wing,
Right.
but the editorials may skew right." But I
some
actually,
of the best writers in America write for the Wall Street Journal.
and I like hearing other opinions than my own because I want to listen to them and understand them. But I find today that NPR is it's really, God help me, someone will quote me as saying this, but to me, it's often as bad as listening to Fox News, which my late father, the news junkie, wound up listening to in the last years of his life, God help him. It probably killed him faster than his kidney disease would have, but it's just the introduction of opinion is really toxic. And I'm probably just old school, which is why it's a good thing I'm writing books, because I couldn't get a job in the media right now anyway. But that's why I choose not to listen to broadcast news.
So I'm trying to sort through these. Do you see a different role for a producer and on-air talent? Do you see those roles differently?
Sure, absolutely. I can be more specific than that without being, I've been both. I burned out on broadcasting. I particularly hated being on television, which I was at MSNBC, because literally it didn't matter what I said as long as my hair looked good. And that was really telling. And even in public radio, the brevity, while it was really good for my writing skills, and it was fun. I loved being able to tell stories at Marketplace, particularly when I was a morning host, because it was pithy and fast paced. But the brevity of it is very difficult. And if you don't have a terrific producer, it can be complicated. But I feel like I'm not really answering your question, and I'd like to. So I guess, do you want me to describe the difference? Or
Yes, why don't you?
Okay, so a producer is like an editor is, like the man who commissioned, or not commissioned, but who purchased this book from me, Up All Night. He worked with me editorially to have a dialogue, not a literal dialogue, about how this book was structured, and what he felt could be helped with it, and inserted into it, what he felt it had too much of, not enough of. And that's basically what a producer does. But of course, it's much faster paced. And sadly, my uncle said to me a few years ago about how super some interviewer was on NPR. And I said, well, how thoughtful his questions were. And I said, do you realize that they don't make up the questions? There's somebody behind the scenes who's read the book and done the pre-production and gives that person a list of questions that host asks, because the host doesn't have the time to synthesize. Susan Stamberg's day, it might have been different, but today it's definitely not a one-person band. It's a team of people. A booker gets the guest, a producer formats the segment, and then the host reads the copy, tweaks it. I'm not saying the host isn't a wise, intelligent person. In some cases they aren't. Usually on public radio they are, but it's definitely something that's extremely scripted and tightly edited. Those little gem interviews that you hear, even the ones with Terry Gross that last an hour, are not just spontaneous conversations like this one that we're having right now.
So how do you perceive CNN's politics at this point? Is it the opposite of Fox News, or somewhere in the middle? Or how do you think about CNN at this stage?
Anything I would say about CNN or Fox is based on what I hear about it, because as I say, I don't watch it. But it's my understanding, a mentee of mine from many years ago is Brian Stelter, who has that show on Sunday mornings called Reliable Sources. And, I'll follow him on Twitter just to see what he's up to, because I've known him since he was a kid. And I'm shocked by the tone that he's inserting in. He's supposed to be the media analyst, and he's sort of an advocate. He's an activist as much as he's a media analyst to me. So if that's representative of what's going on the rest of the place, that's part of why I don't watch it.
So could you give us, someone wants to have.
Oh, wait, can I step back 1 second?
Sure.
But you have to understand the roots of why that happened. And that's because of this complex situation where Murdoch launched this channel. I mean, Murdoch's history is fascinating and important. And, those who don't know about it should read up on it, because it's very interesting. But he came in and, Ted Turner was at that point established as the czar of CNN, even though, as I say, he was not a left-wing he was not married to Jane Fonda when he started CNN. He had zero point of view politically at CNN. He was sort of right-wing. He had this wife who he'd met at the Republican Club, but it was a different era. And so 1996 comes along, and Fox comes along with Murdoch and Ailes, who I don't even know how much they believed any of what they were propagating, but they were basically starting a business the way, Burger King and McDonald's had to fight with each other after each were well established by distinguishing themselves. And Fox chose to distinguish itself by becoming this darling of the right. And so CNN, not instantaneously, MSNBC, not instantaneously. When I worked at MSNBC in the early 2000s, it was not like that. I used to have to appear on that show with Paul Begala and Ollie North, and crossfire shows, reading emails. I'd love the New York Times to read emails to Paul Begala and Ollie North. No wonder I hated television so much. basically, if you look at that, as I say, and all of you probably know this, it was incremental, Fox came in, it had its point of view. CNN and MSNBC are sort of skitzing out, trying to figure out, well, what do we do? What do we do? We're losing, nobody's watching us. And then, all of a sudden the Trump storm occurred, and that kind of locked everybody into place in terms of, coming up with, my father always used to say, Gypsy Rose Lee, the stripper, said you have to have a gimmick. Well, they had to have a gimmick. And so what was the gimmick? If Fox is going to be right wing, MSNBC and CNN are going to tilt in another direction because they have to do something if they want to survive. That's basically as simple as it is. So I don't believe any of them, which is why I can't watch it. I mean, I know that some of the people who go on those channels do fervently believe whatever it is they're spouting, but I think it's just a bunch of theatrics, which is why I'm so boring.
Well, there are these stories about pretty big fights within the Murdoch family politically about how to think about Fox News. And what I get out of that is that ultimately there are elements in the family that just can't cut themselves loose from the money making that the opinion makers are making for them at night.
Guess what? It's all about money. And that's why public broadcasting started. And I have to say that what you probably didn't see in my resume is that at one of the failed startups that I worked for, not master's degrees, but failed startups, was a place called Fox News Channel, which was started, Fox News Service, which was started well before Roger Ailes and the Fox News Channel came along. And they hired away my boss at CNN, a guy named Paul Amos, who'd been turned over for the Tom Johnson job. Anybody who remembers Tom Johnson here at the LA Times, when he got hired to run CNN, Paul got passed over for that job. And so the Fox News people came along and started a news service, because up until that point, Fox Metro Media was buying news clips from CNN. And so some bean counter said, we can't keep giving money to CNN. This is way before Ailes, way before right-wing news. Nobody called, the news business didn't operate that way then. That kind of dialogue wasn't permitted. Even if you were right-wing, you didn't talk about your politics. You weren't supposed to. That's just how it was. And then Fox came along and upended all of it. But I did work for this Fox News service. And there was never a struggle, because it was all a bunch of people who'd come over from CNN who were trying to mimic what had happened over at CNN. And then when I'm getting sort of off the path, but it was all because Ailes and Murdoch came in. And of course, it's all about money. And anybody who thinks otherwise, there are people who say to me when I speak, what about ProPublica and what about public broadcasting? Well, public broadcasting is filled with money too. It has to be. You need money to create things, to create news, to exist. And it's about a sensibility. And if you're running a business, as anybody here knows, it's got to have a bottom line. And if you are ruthless, which sadly many business people are, not all of them, that's what happens, and that's what's happened. And guess what? It's destroyed our society.
So people want your email address. So you should tell me whether you want. If that's okay with you, then I'll have Sandra pass it.
Sure. Oh, sure.
I mean, your email address is available on your website, so it's not exactly a secret.
It's lisa@lisanapoli.com. But please don't send me any notes about send me any notes you want. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. I really am curious what you have to say, but I can't, tell you anything more about how to fix it. Because if I did, I should be running.
Come on, tell us how to fix it.
I could run a journalism school, except there's only one problem. I haven't got my master's degree. I've got to go finish my homework.
So given the partial funding of both NPR and public TV, money from the government,
can I stop you? There isn't much money from the government. They don't get
because they keep cutting it back.
Well, you know what? That's not even true. I'm sorry. That is true, but it's misrepresented. For me, I can't speak as much about public broadcasting. I'm sorry, public television as I can about public radio. Public radio is a strange ecosystem financially, and I write about it a little bit in this book, how it got to that point. But basically, there's how you listen to public radio. In this market, it's KCRW or KPCC. And then there's the network, NPR. And the government isn't subsidizing all of these places. You know, it's not, it's if you go on to the NPR website, you can see how little money they get from the government. I mean, the government, of course, is a vast ecosystem too. The stations, the independent stations, which by the way are becoming less and less independent because they get rolled up by, like in this market, American Public Media, which is out of Minnesota. This is way in the weeds, but everybody should understand it, because if you give money to something, I think you should understand how the money is spent. And if you hear the people are cutting back, you should understand that that's not necessarily true. It was initially a different animal than it is today. And today, the stations they're completely independent from NPR, which is funded completely differently than the local stations are. When you give your money, you're giving money to a local station, not to NPR, not to PRI or the other creators of the programming that the independent stations buy. And the independent stations, many of them are extremely rich. If you look at their form, what is it? Their 990s. I'm sorry, I can't remember right now. If you look at their financials, which some of them make it very hard to do, they have millions and millions of dollars in assets. And if they get governmental money, it's because they're getting operating money because of the licensing of the station to the university that holds that broadcast license. It's a very, like I said, I could talk about it. I only understand it. I understand it better than most people. And even then, it's a very complicated thing to understand. When Joan Kroc gave $25 million to NPR back in 2003, when she died, she didn't give it to KPCC and KCRW. She gave it to NPR, and it's in a restricted fund. They put it into their endowment. It's a completely different ecosystem. And so this malarkey that people propagate about government funding being cut, or that it should be cut, the conversation that people should be having is, how is this stuff funded? Because most people don't know. Most people who work in it don't know. It's shocking when people see how much money some of these stations have in their coffers. And that's not to say that they don't deserve your support. It's just to say that understanding the financial ecosystem, it takes a lot of work, as it does with everything. And it's a lot of time.
So in your view, are the media markets or the media in other countries, UK, France, Germany, do you see them as being less polarized than in the US, or about the same or more?
I couldn't speak to that. I haven't spent much time out of the country in years, except in Bhutan. And, you know, when I do watch the news in Bhutan, which I do because I find it interesting there, especially the very local news, as opposed to the other news that they get in, which is from India or CNN International. You know, it doesn't seem like it is here yet, but I've watched democracy unfold in Bhutan over the last 10 years from a distance. And as I say, Bhutan has as many people in the country that we have in the LA Unified School District. So it's not a very big place, but the whole mentality of fighting and backstabbing and yelling and shouting, as opposed to working together, is definitely starting to creep into that system too, because that's, I think, what television does.
Okay, I want to spend a little time. I know that you've spent energy and time working at the Downtown Women's Center and volunteer cooking in that group, and I'd like to give you a chance to sort of give your observations about sort of the state of homelessness in LA, and any thoughts that you might have on how we might tackle it.
If I knew how to fix it, I would be doing it right now. The only thing I knew as a longtime resident of downtown Los Angeles is that I despaired to see so many people in such terrible shape. And this is a decade ago. So I did the only thing I knew that I could do, because I knew I couldn't fix the problem. And that was, I researched the place that seemed most amenable to having me come help. I used to have a party here in my apartment every Friday night for many years. And so what I did was I canceled the party and invited everybody who used to come here for a party every Friday night to come cook with me at the homeless shelter. And that's what we did. And, you know, when they needed something, we'd reach out to our network and say, who's got the money, or can people pitch in? When people had surplus something, they'd bring it there. That was all I knew that I could do. And people would say, oh, I feel so helpless, you know, just cooking this meal that 120 people are going to have for lunch tomorrow. And I said, you know, what is better than nothing. And I don't know what else to do, but it's clear that it's about affordable housing and mental illness. And I just don't know how to address either of those two very huge topics. I live across the street from the LA Grand Hotel, which became a Project Room Key site to house people during the pandemic, which is wonderful because that hotel is the epicenter of the Jose Huizar scandal, and who knows what would have happened to it. But sadly, what's happened is that now we have people who leave that facility and walk across to the little store here and buy booze and consume it outside our building because they can't bring it back into the shelter. And then there have been rows of tents on Figueroa Street set up to sell people drugs. So it's a you know, a good thing brought a bad thing. And it's, you know, they're the things that we've seen down here since the pandemic started are hair raising. So, and the things certainly that you see on Skid Row are hair raising, but I have no idea what the solution is.
So you're working on, or you're pitching some new ideas for a new book. Why don't you pitch it to this group? What do you got? What do you got coming up?
Well, I'm working on a book right now about Marian Anderson and the Lincoln Center concert. The Lincoln Memorial concert. My New York bias, it must be that library behind you, Dave. Marian Anderson's famous concert at the Lincoln Memorial on April 9th, 1939. I wanted to do a biography that wasn't directly media related, but that was a different moment in time than I've written about before. I wanted to look at the thorny and complex question of race, and I settled, hopefully I'll be able to find a publisher for it, on April 9th, 1939, and this famous concert that she gave because she was prohibited from singing at the Daughters of American Revolution Hall, Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C.
Okay, I really appreciate about you giving us the time today, and I'm sure everybody in our group did as well. Again, if you haven't picked up Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki, buy it. You'll enjoy it. You'll love every moment of it. So
thank you.
Do that.
And I've just put a link into the chat where if people want signed copies of my books or other books, my husband runs a thing called Live Talks Los Angeles. So there's a way for you to buy books from there. And it's a minority owned immigrant small business. So
we're checking off a lot of boxes.
Lots of boxes there. Yes. Local author, everything. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye. So next month, Thursday, November 18th, via Zoom at 1:30, we have Dr. Jolene Russell and Dr. Emily Fisher of, you heard about them, Science Moms, a nonpartisan group of climate scientists and mothers that aim to demystify climate science and motivate everyday moms to demand solutions that preserve the planet for their kids. The two climate scientists in conversation discussing new approaches to activism. So Thursday, November 16th, via Zoom webinar, 1:30. Be there, be square. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.